Philosophy of Mind, Lecture 5, Functionalism.
In the last lecture, we examined the identity theory, the theory that mental states are identical to brain states. We saw how the identity theorist might respond to several kinds of objections, but ended by observing that the phenomenon of multiple realizability, that the very same type of mental state might be realized in many different sorts of underlying types of brain states, seemed to undermine the alleged identity of mental states and brain states. This point sets the stage for our next theory, the next alternative to dualism, a theory called functionalism. Before we can get to the theory itself, we need to explain the basic concept of what's called a functional role. So here are a couple of examples of functional roles. The basic idea of functionalism will be that a mental state is a functional state, one defined by a functional role. So we'll have a couple of examples and analyze afterwards. We'll borrow our first example from the Australian philosopher David Armstrong. Consider the concept of a poison. What makes something a poison is that it has fairly well-specified causal consequences. When a creature ingests it, it causes various undesirable effects such as discomfort, illness, disease, maybe death. So understood, being a poison is a relative notion. What's a poison for one individual or perhaps one species might not be a poison for someone else or something else. So understood further, the property of being a poison is not something a substance has intrinsically on its own, considered in isolation from other beings. Something is a poison only in relation to the individuals in which it's capable of causing those bad effects. If those individuals were not to exist, the substance would no longer be a poison. And so understood, finally, many different substances can be poisons or count as poisons, insofar as many different substances can have these sorts of causal relations, or as philosophers like to say, occupy the same causal role we've just specified. Chemicals, bacteria, viruses, snake venoms, acids, all can be poisons because all are capable of inflicting various kinds of harms on various kinds of creatures. Indeed, a particular poisonous chemical, such as bleach, might have essentially no intrinsic chemical properties in common with a particular poisonous venom or a toxic virus. They might be composed of entirely different molecules or atoms with entirely different molecular structures. And yet all count as poisons by definition, because poison doesn't have to do with the particular intrinsic structure of the thing, but poison is defined in terms of occupying the same causal roles in various conditions, causing discomfort, illness, or death in various sorts of creatures. To connect this to functionalism, we would say that the concept of a poison is defined functionally by a functional role. Many different substances can occupy that same functional role, substances which intrinsically have nothing in common, and may share only the fact that they can cause the same sorts of effects in various contexts. Moreover, what's most important for us now is that we can easily distinguish the functional role so defined from the individual thing that might fill or play or occupy that role. The functional role is defined here as having a tendency to cause discomfort, illness, or death in a certain species, while the individual thing occupying that role might be a chemical, a bacterium, or a venom. Second example of functional roles. Consider the notion of President of the United States. This concept, too, is defined functionally, that is, in terms of very well-specified procedures. Any person who fits certain criteria and who's elected by these procedures earns the label U.S. President. The U.S. President at a given time is that individual who occupies that well-specified functional role. But again, we can and must distinguish the individual from the role. After all, the individuals occupying that role come and go every 4 or 8 years typically, while the role, the institution itself, if you like, remains. As philosophers, we might say that the concept of the U.S. President is functionally defined by the specified set of procedures, but the set of procedures themselves determine which individual thing to whom the concept applies. So what these examples illustrate is what it might be like to define mental states in functional terms, that is, in terms of their causal or functional roles, that is, in terms of what sorts of things typically cause them and what sorts of things they, in turn, typically cause. What's left out of such definitions, one must always notice, is precisely whatever it is that is occupying the functional role. So again, poisons will be defined in terms of what they cause. It doesn't matter what their intrinsic chemical structure is. You as president is defined in terms of a set of procedures. It doesn't matter who is filling the role itself. So we distinguish the functional role from the thing or perhaps many different things that might occupy that role. Mental states as functional states. We can now state the basic idea of the theory known as functionalism. It's this, that mental states should be understood as functional states, and that is to say that mental states should be defined in terms of their functional roles. So what defines a particular mental state type is the causal relations that state bears to bodily or sensory input, other types of mental states, and ultimately behavioral output. So what makes a given mental state a particular type of qualia state, for example, such as pain, is that it's typically caused to result from various sorts of bodily injuries. It typically causes other types of mental states, such as misery and unhappiness, and it typically causes various behaviors to ensue, such as screaming or going for help or getting a Band-Aid, or avoiding the source of the injury in the first place. Similarly, functionalism continues. What makes a given type of mental state a particular type of intentional state, such as the belief that it's raining, would be that it's typically caused by perceptions or reports of rain. It tends to cause various rain-related other mental states, such as the thought, I wonder where my umbrella is, and the desire that it not be raining. And of course, it tends to cause or produce appropriate rain-related behaviors, such as grabbing a raincoat or an umbrella. What's key is that functionalism places absolutely no constraints on what it is that might occupy these functional roles, what it is that realizes or instantiates the mental state in question, so that any system, whether it's physical in nature or even non-physical, can be in pain just as long as it can have states which are caused in the way I just described and typically cause the things I just described. It's this idea, distinguishing the functional role from the thing occupying the role or playing that role, and thus placing no constraints on what occupies the role, that gives functionalism its impressive strengths. To see this, let's briefly compare and contrast it with its two main predecessors, behaviorism and identity theory, which we've discussed in the past two lectures. Functionalism, behaviorism, and identity theory. Like behaviorism, functionalism understands that mental states are closely related to bodily input or sensory input and our behavioral output. So closely related that there's what we called in Lecture 3 a conceptual connection between the two. The very concept of a particular mental state is partly defined in terms of its relations to sensory or bodily input and behavioral output. So what makes something even count as a pain, in other words, is at least partly how it's related to our sensory input and the types of behaviors it subsequently causes. But unlike behaviorism, functionalism is quite willing to include other mental states in the relevant definitions. What makes something a particular intentional state, such as a belief, is not only how it's related to perceptual input and behavioral output, but also how it might be related to other beliefs and desires and thoughts and so on. So unlike behaviorism, which tried and failed to eliminate mental states in its analyses altogether, functionalism isn't trying to eliminate the mental, and thus isn't failing. Yet, like both behaviorism and identity theory, functionalism is ultimately interested in maintaining physicalism. How does it do that now? By borrowing the key insight from the identity theorist. While the concept of a particular type of mental state may be defined by a functional role, as we've seen, what's important for the physicalist functionalist is also what it is that occupies that role, namely some sort of brain state, no doubt. The functional role, the definition, the concept of the mental state does not eliminate the mental, but the theory remains physicalist as long as it insists that whatever occupies that functional role, whatever it is that actually fits that definition or concept, is physical, like a brain state. But here now is the key advantage that functionalism would enjoy over identity theory. There's no reason to hold that problematic type identity between the mental state type and the brain state type that identity theory insisted on in our last lecture. To see why, let's return to our examples. No one seems inclined to hold a type identity between the type poison and whatever it is that is the poison. We easily recognize that different sorts of things can occupy the functional role which defines a poison. So the type poison just does not map one-to-one with, let's say, the type chemical structure C, some particular chemical structure. Things other than that chemical structure can also be poisoned. Similarly, there's no type identity between U.S. president and any particular individual who is the president at a given time. Different individuals can occupy that functional role at different times. So we can't identify the type U.S. president with, let's say, the genetic constitution of Barack Obama, even if Obama occupies that role at a given time. For people other than Obama can also be U.S. president. So too then, there need be no type identity between a mental state type and anything physical, such as a brain state type, according to the functionalist. Pain can be realized or instantiated in one type of brain state in one individual or species, and in an entirely different type of brain state in a different individual or species. As long as whatever is occupying the functional role of pain is a physical thing, the physicalist can be satisfied. It doesn't have to be the same type of physical thing in every case. So now, is functionalism the final answer to the mind-body question, the solution to all the mind-body problems? To be sure, there is much to be said in its favor. So here are some of the advantages of functionalism. First, functionalism avoids some of the limitations of behaviorism and the identity theory, the latter in particular by accommodating the multiple realizability we explored in the last lecture. Different creatures, either across species or individuals within a species, can count as having the same types of mental states even if they have very different physical structures. They can do that just as long as those different physical structures can occupy the same or analogous causal roles. So both human beings and dogs, and even those Martians with their silicon brains, can be in pain as long as our very different brain states can occupy or support analogous causal roles. A second advantage of functionalism is that it offers something that's very useful to the scientist who's interested in studying our mental lives. It's this: a functionalist psychology can become a theory of the mind that is essentially autonomous with respect to lower-level sciences. Now that's not quite as complicated as it sounds. What it means simply is that psychology can be studied largely independently from, say, neuroscience. You could become a psychologist, develop and test theories about how the mind works, without first having to master the detailed and complex and largely unknown science of the brain. Why is that? Well, if mental states really are functional states, defined by their various causes and effects, then it just doesn't matter what the underlying substance is which realizes or instantiates those states. Indeed, the whole idea of multiple realizability, that creatures with very different brain structures might yet have the same mental states, reflects this idea of autonomy. We can study the nature of sensations and thoughts and so on, all as shared by creatures with very different brains, even without knowing the underlying nature of those brains themselves. Or when a cognitive scientist develops a theory that, let's say, depth perception requires the agent to bring knowledge of the world to bear on incoming sensory data, the scientist can do that and test that theory without studying neuroscience first. The mental states are defined in terms of their causal roles, not in terms of what the nature of the brain is that's realizing those mental states. And in fact, this same autonomy underlies the whole idea of artificial intelligence, which is the idea that computers might ultimately be programmable in such a way as to count as having genuine mentality, genuine sensations, perceptions, intentional states such as thoughts and beliefs. Although we'll devote our entire next lecture, Lecture 6, to that topic, even now we can observe that no one thinks that the computer is precisely like the brain, purely physically speaking. Computers are made of very different physical materials, structured very differently, and they operate on very different principles from the brain. Yet functionalism says that the computer doesn't have to be just like the brain physically in order to realize or instantiate mental states. It merely has to be able to be in states occupying the same causal roles as our mental states do. And that, of course, is the job of programmers to bring about. In fact, the most influential version of functionalism does a lot with this idea, and it's known as the computational theory of mind. We'll return to this issue later, but for now we can state that perhaps the most important advantage of functionalism is simply this, that in allowing the science of the mind to be autonomous from lower-level sciences such as neuroscience, it supports the very possibility of artificial intelligence. And again, we'll return to this in the next lecture. Now let's turn to some problems for functionalism. There's no doubt that functionalism has been a very popular and influential theory. In fact, probably the most popular and most influential theory of the ones we've been studying, and versions of it remain extremely dominant today. But there's also no doubt that the theory has some problems to deal with, and actually some very interesting and intriguing problems, in my opinion. Broadly speaking, the problems fall into two categories, those dealing with intentional states and those dealing with qualia. We'll briefly present the first category and then preserve our detailed discussion of it until our next lecture on computer minds. And we'll spend the remainder of this lecture exploring the discussion primarily generated by the problems concerning qualia. But before we get going, let's observe that there are basically two strategies available for objecting to functionalism. Functionalism claims that mental states are functional states, that is, defined by their causes and effects. Well, that claim suggests two things. First, that any being which has the appropriately defined mental states must have states with the appropriate causes and effects. And from the reverse direction, second, any being which has states with those causes and effects must also have the relevant mental states. Or to put those slightly differently, according to the first, it's impossible for something to be in a given mental state if it lacks the appropriate causes and effects, if mental states are defined in terms of causes and effects. And according to the second, it's impossible not to have the relevant mental state if a thing is in a state with the appropriate causes and effects. The two strategies for objecting to functionalism correspond to challenging each of those two suggestions, as we will see in just a moment. The main problem that functionalism faces with respect to intentionality derives from the second. So let's turn to functionalism and intentionality. You'll recall that intentional states, otherwise known as propositional attitudes, are mental states which involve both a proposition and an attitude. For example, thinking that P, believing that P, hoping that Q, and so on, where the P's and Q's refer to propositions. To be in an intentional state is to be in a state that is directed towards or about something such as a proposition. The paradigm examples were thoughts, beliefs, and desires. Now, the first category of difficulties for functionalism are centered on the claim that functionalism just cannot give an adequate account of intentional states. And the main strategy for this objection is the second one just mentioned. It seems possible to conceive of cases where something has states with the appropriate causes and effects, but where we'd say that it lacked the relevant mental states. The most famous version of this objection is due to one of the most influential articles in perhaps all of the philosophy of mind, the Berkeley philosopher John Searle's notorious article, Minds, Brains, and Programs. This article appeared in 1980 in a very interesting journal called Behavioral and Brain Sciences, which invites lots of people to respond to the article and offers Searle's responses to them. This article and that debate will be the main topic of our next lecture. But for here, let's merely note that in this article, Searle introduced a thought experiment in which he claimed there was clearly a system that would count as functionally equivalent to a person who genuinely understands the Chinese language. To say the system was functionally equivalent is to say that it exhibited states that had all the appropriate causes and effects of the states of a fluent speaker of Chinese. So, for example, if you said something in Chinese to it, it would give an appropriate Chinese response back. But Searle argued there was one problem. The thought experiment seemed to show that this system merely mimicked genuine understanding of Chinese. It did not, in fact, display the true mental state of understanding. And so we have, in Searle's example, a strong candidate for a case where a system has all the right functional states, all the right causes and effects. It gives appropriate Chinese answers when Chinese questions are posed to it, and yet, he argues, it lacks the corresponding mental state. If so, then mental states simply cannot be identified with functional states. But as we'll see, there's much more to be said on the subject, and we'll get into the nitty-gritty in the next lecture. Let's turn then to functionalism and qualia. The term qualia, you'll recall, refers to the qualitative aspects of conscious experience, what it's like to sense and to perceive various things. And the charge against functionalism, probably the most potent one, is that it cannot accommodate this aspect of the mind. This charge can be made by way of either of the two strategies we sketched a few moments ago. First, there was functionalism's suggestion that it's impossible for something to be in a given mental state if it lacks states with the appropriately defined causes and effects. Well now, is this really true with respect to qualia? Consider some feeling of excruciating pain, my favorite example being stepping on a nail and the pain that ensues. Under normal circumstances, feelings of pain are part of a causal network. They're typically caused by physical injuries or diseases, and they typically cause, in turn, any number of other mental states or physical behaviors. But that's under normal circumstances. According to functionalism, these causes and effects define what pain is. A state is a pain due to having these sorts of causes and effects, and that's where functionalism seems to go too far. For it seems easy to sever states like pains, and most or all other qualia, from their typical causes and effects, at least conceptually in our minds and our imaginations. Imagine stepping on that nail and feeling that excruciating pain in your foot. Now focus on the pain itself, and conceive of experiencing that very same sensation even without having stepped on a nail. That seems as easy as can be. And if we can do that, then the concept of pain itself does not intrinsically involve any connections to the normal causes of pain, as opposed to what functionalism claims. What pain is, in other words, is that feeling, independent of whatever causal roles that feeling may typically play, independent of whatever might typically cause that pain. And a similar point can be made about the typical effects of pain. Sure, painful feelings typically cause behaviors such as screams and groans and running for help, although I suppose not with a nail in your foot. But borrowing Hilary Putnam's example of the Super Stoics again from Lecture 3, it's easy enough to conceive of individuals capable of coping with extremely high levels of pain. It's easy to conceive of an individual who genuinely feels even excruciating pain, but who does not scream or groan or run for help. But to conceive of that is to recognize that our concept of pain does not intrinsically involve any connections to the normal effects of having pains, again opposed to functionalism's claim that the definition of pain includes its causal effects. So if pain is not defined by its typical causals and effects, as functionalism claims, what's it defined by? How it feels. It's qualia. And that's precisely what functionalism does not seem to give an adequate account of. Let's now turn to the second strategy for objecting to functionalism's account of qualia. Let's now turn to the second strategy for objecting to functionalism with respect to qualia. This strategy challenged functionalism's suggestion that it's impossible for a state to have all the appropriate causes and effects without simply being the mental state in question. But now, is this really true for qualia? Or is it possible to imagine states having all those causes and effects and yet not being the mental state in question, even somehow failing to be genuine mental states with qualia altogether? Two of the more popular variations on this strategy are these. The first is called inverted qualia. It's an idea that actually goes a long way back in philosophy. Suppose you and I, we both look at a banana and we say yellow. And we both look at some grass in the summer and we say green, and the sky on a clear day and say blue. But now, how do we know that our inner sensations in fact are the same or even similar? For the following scenario seems conceivable at least, that what you see when you look at grass is in fact yellow, except that you've learned since childhood to call things looking that color green. Similarly, what you see when you look at the sky in fact looks green, except you've learned from childhood to call things looking like that blue. Indeed, it seems conceivable that perhaps all the colors you see are inverted in some way relative to what I see. You call yellows green, and green's blue, and blue's orange, and so on. On this scenario, where our qualia are inverted relative to each other, we might still behave in all the same ways. We both call bananas yellow, we both call grass green and the sky blue, and yet what's occurring on the inside, what we're experiencing, couldn't be more different. The suggestion isn't that this is actual, that our behaviors are indistinguishable and yet we actually have different qualia. The suggestion is merely that this sort of scenario is conceivable. And as long as it's merely conceivable, then functionalism is in trouble. For according to functionalism, if two states in two individuals have exactly the same causes and effects, the same functional role, then those states would be the very same type of mental state. These causal roles literally define what type of mental state they are. And yet the conceivability of these inverted spectra cases shows that we can imagine two states having exactly the same causes and effects, resulting from and causing indistinguishable behaviors, while being about as different as two mental states could be. You're seeing yellow, I'm seeing green, even if we're behaving in all the same ways. The conclusion would be the same. Causes and effects do not define qualitative mental states after all. What defines them seems to be their qualitative nature, what they're like, what it's like to experience them, no matter what causes and effects they might typically have. The second variation on this theme is something called absent qualia. Now zombies, yes, I'm talking about zombies, have been popular in movies and horror fiction for many, many years, and we're all familiar with the basic image of a human-like figure stumbling towards its victim, perhaps muttering, "Brains, must eat brains," as it reaches out to break open a skull. Well, philosophers like zombies too, not merely despite, but in fact because of the mindless quality of the entertainment. For the mindlessness is actually key. A zombie to a philosopher is an example of a being whose behavior might be very much like our own, at least in non-brain-eating respects, but who, at least by conceived by philosophers, is lacking something quite essential to us. A zombie, in other words, is a mindless being, no consciousness. Now, certainly the resistance that many have to computer minds, as we'll explore in the next lecture, suggests this idea, namely the idea of a being who might behave very much like us, and yet not merely have inverted qualia, as we were just discussing, but in fact have nothing at all going on inside. If you are resistant to the idea of artificial intelligence, of computers counting as genuinely having minds, it's probably because you feel that no matter how good computers are at doing things, no matter how competently they might navigate the world, there's just nobody home on the inside. There's nothing that it's like to be a computer. And that is just how philosophers conceive of zombies. They do all that zombie stuff. They perhaps successfully navigate the world around them, but there's nothing that it's like on the inside. There's no there, to use the popular expression. They lack consciousness. The most colorful treatment of this issue is due to the New York University philosopher Ned Block. In an influential article called Troubles with Functionalism, Block imagines the following scenario. He writes, quote, "Suppose we convert the government of China to functionalism, and we convince its officials that it would enormously enhance their prestige to realize a human mind for an hour. We provide each of the billion-plus people in China with a specially designed two-way radio that connects them to other persons and to some artificial body, fitted with a radio transmitter and receiver. Surely such a system is not physically impossible. It could be functionally equivalent to you for a short time, say an hour." End quote. So Block's idea is that the entire population of China might functionally mirror the neurons in your brain. After all, the activity of each neuron in your brain is entirely a function of how it receives causal input and what sorts of responses it contributes as causal output onto other neurons to which it's connected. So we can easily conceive that each individual person is connected to other persons, just as each individual neuron is connected to other neurons. And we can further conceive that the way any given neuron responds to causal input and produces causal output can be mirrored in the way each individual Chinese person receives and transmits radio signals to the other persons to whom he or she is connected. If it's your brain which is being modeled, then this collection of a billion persons we can easily conceive is precisely modeling you, displaying exactly the same states with exactly the same causes and effects as your brain. That's what Bloch means when he says that this system could be functionally equivalent to you for an hour. But here's the point. This system seems conceivable. But there is an enormous difference between you, and your brain anyway, and the population of China as a whole. You, or your brain, is conscious, aware, has mental states. But surely the population of China as a whole does not. Now let's be clear. Each individual Chinese person in this example is conscious, of course. The point is that the collection of people as a collection is not. Your brain might currently be processing a sensation of red, say, or maybe the smell of garlic. But the collection of people as a whole isn't sensing or experiencing anything. It's just a bunch of people communicating by radio, after all. It's just, we might say, a very large zombie, or zombie brain. But if so, then functionalism has a problem. For here we have a system which has states displaying all the same causes and effects as the states of a human brain, and yet it lacks the corresponding mental states, the qualia. What that illustrates then is that qualia, these qualitative conscious mental states, simply are not defined by their causal roles. What are they defined by? How they feel, what it's like to experience them, and that's something that's simply distinct from their typical causal connections, or at least so the criticism claims. There is, of course, more to be said here. Philosophers are rarely at a loss of words. In the next lecture, we'll explore the responses to Searle's critique of functionalism in some detail. And in our final lecture, Lecture 14, we'll explore a position known as eliminativism, which seeks to deny, in effect, the reality of the mental altogether. We'll see there some ways to resist these objections to functionalism that we've just been exploring, some ways to deny, in effect, that there really are such qualia distinguishable from a state's causes and effects. So the debate shall carry on in later lectures. Before it does so, let's briefly review what we've covered in this lecture. We began by sketching the basic idea of a functional state or role, that is, a concept defined by its typical causes and effects. We then sketched the basic idea of functionalism, according to which mental states just are functional states. Amongst functionalism's virtues was that it kept what was best about behaviorism and identity theory while avoiding their problems, but then we saw that functionalism has some problems of its own as well. It had a problem accommodating qualia, which seemed to be quite distinguishable from their typical causes and effects, and it had a problem giving the right account of intentionality in light of the possibility of systems which are functionally equivalent to us and yet which lack intentional states altogether. It is to this idea that we will now turn in our next lecture.
This ends Lecture 5,